What does it mean when a country goes bankrupt? When a country goes bankrupt, it doesn't mean it shuts down like a company or that its land and people are auctioned off to pay creditors. Instead, the term is sovereign default, which means the government can no longer meet its financial obligations. This usually involves missing scheduled interest payments on loans, failing to repay bonds on time, or officially declaring that it cannot pay its debts. Sovereign default destroys confidence in the nation's economy because it signals to the world that the government is unreliable and financially unstable. Unlike companies or individuals, nations cannot declare bankruptcy through a legal process that wipes out debt. They still exist, but they must face the global consequences of broken promises. Countries like Argentina, Venezuela, and Sri Lanka have all been through such crises in recent decades, and their examples show just how devastating it can be when a country goes broke. Why do countries go bankrupt? There is no single reason why nations fall into financial collapse. It's usually a toxic mix of poor decisions, structural weaknesses, and external shocks. Some governments borrow excessively, funding expensive projects, subsidies, or welfare programs without generating enough income to pay them back. Others suffer from corruption, where money that should go into infrastructure or development ends up in the pockets of politicians and elites. External events like wars, natural disasters, global recessions, or pandemics can also tip fragile economies over the edge. Countries that rely too heavily on one resource or industry are especially vulnerable. Venezuela's collapse was fueled by its dependence on oil. When prices dropped, the government lost most of its revenue. Similarly, Sri Lanka's crisis in 2022 was worsened by a collapse in tourism during COVID-19, combined with years of reckless borrowing for vanity projects like ports and airports. When the balance between spending and income breaks, bankruptcy becomes inevitable. Immediate impact on the government. The government is the first to face the consequences of default. Once creditors lose trust, they stop lending money. This is a huge problem because many governments rely on constant borrowing just to function. Without new loans, the government suddenly runs out of cash to pay for essential expenses like salaries, pensions, welfare payments, and infrastructure projects. Some governments attempt to solve the problem by printing more money, but this usually leads to hyperinflation, where prices rise uncontrollably and the currency becomes worthless. Zimbabwe is a classic case. In the 2000s, its government printed so much money that a loaf of bread cost billions of Zimbabwean dollars. Citizens carried wheelbarrows of cash just to buy groceries. In such situations, public trust in the government collapses, and people often look for ways to bypass the official economy, such as turning to foreign currencies or bartering systems. Collapse of the national currency. One of the most immediate and visible effects of bankruptcy is a dramatic fall in the value of the national currency. When lenders, investors, and businesses lose faith, they quickly pull out their money, exchanging the local currency for stronger ones like the US dollar or euro. This causes the value of the local currency to crash. A weaker currency makes imports, such as fuel, medicine, food, and technology, far more expensive. Citizens feel the pain directly because their savings lose value overnight and the cost of living skyrockets. In Argentina, where defaults have happened repeatedly, people don't trust their peso. Instead, many convert their salaries to dollars as soon as they get paid, fearing that the peso will lose value within weeks. In Venezuela, the bolivar became so worthless that people used it for handicrafts or wallpaper rather than money. Currency collapse is often the moment when citizens fully realize the depth of the crisis. Everyday struggles for citizens. The true cost of national bankruptcy is carried by ordinary people. Inflation makes food, fuel, and medicine unaffordable. Savings vanish, wages lose value, and unemployment rises as businesses shut down. Public services like healthcare, education, and welfare programs are cut as governments try to save money. In Sri Lanka in 2022, citizens stood in line for days just to buy cooking gas or fuel. In Greece, youth unemployment skyrocketed to more than 50% during the debt crisis, leaving an entire generation with no opportunities. In Venezuela, Years of economic collapse created severe shortages of medicine and basic goods, forcing millions of citizens to flee the country. While the wealthy often find ways to protect themselves by moving money abroad, the poor and middle class suffer the most. National bankruptcy turns everyday life into a struggle for survival. Role of the IMF and global lenders. When countries go bankrupt, they often turn to international institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, or the World Bank. These organizations provide emergency loans to stabilize the economy, but they impose strict conditions known as austerity measures. These may include cutting subsidies, raising taxes, reducing pensions, privatizing state-owned industries, and cutting government spending. While these steps can restore financial balance, they also increase hardship in the short term. In Greece, IMF-driven austerity meant massive cuts to pensions and wages, higher taxes, and the sale of national assets like airports and ports. Citizens often feel punished for mistakes made by their leaders, and resentment toward international lenders grows. Still, without external help, many bankrupt countries would not survive at all. The IMF acts as a global lender of last resort, but its involvement is almost always controversial. Political and social instability. Economic collapse quickly turns into a political crisis. Citizens lose faith in their leaders, protests erupt, and sometimes governments are overthrown. In Argentina in 2001, the crisis led to riots, looting, and the resignation of multiple presidents in just a few weeks. In Sri Lanka in 2022, angry protesters stormed the presidential palace, forcing the president to resign and flee the country. Venezuela's collapse has sparked years of protests, violence, and mass migration, with millions leaving the country in search of better opportunities. Bankruptcy doesn't just damage the economy, it shakes the foundations of democracy and governance. Political instability often makes recovery even harder because new governments face chaos and mistrust. In some cases, economic collapse even paves the way for authoritarian leaders who promise stability but often worsen the situation. Can countries recover from bankruptcy? Recovery from national bankruptcy is possible, but it is always painful and usually takes years, sometimes decades. The first step is debt restructuring, where governments renegotiate with creditors to reduce the total owed or extend the repayment period. After that, countries must implement reforms to restore trust. This may involve diversifying exports, cutting corruption, improving financial transparency, and encouraging foreign investment. Success stories exist. Iceland recovered relatively quickly from its 2008 banking collapse by restructuring banks and protecting citizens. Mexico also managed to recover after defaulting in 1982 by adopting reforms and stabilizing its economy. But some countries, like Argentina, have defaulted multiple times because they fail to make lasting changes. Recovery depends heavily on leadership, discipline, and the willingness of citizens to endure short-term pain for long-term stability.